Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you guys are having a lovely Sunday. We are starting a little early today because, I'm not even halfway through A Christmas Carol, and I want to get this book done before December. I don't want to be in January trying to get to the part where Scrooge stops being a jerk. So we're going to be spending 2 hours reading A Christmas Carol today instead of just one. So I've got my drinks lined up so I can have a sip throughout. Though before we get started, I'm gonna set up the slideshow and a couple more announcements. So I do have the print file set up. I was going to do Print Ninja for my printing, but then John from John's Lawn Box, he pointed me to a different website which was much more user friendly and a lot cheaper too, and they offer way more stuff than Print Ninja do, so I'm gonna go with those guys. I have everything lined up and I just need to send the print order. I'm just putting in sent them an email with a few questions I have. I want to make sure I get this done right because my comic book is 22 pages, but you have to have increments of 4, so I just have a few questions there. And this is my first comic book, so I am hella nervous about making sure I get this done right the first time around. It's probably going to have a few hiccups along the way, but whatever. And also, I'm sorry last week that the last bit of the stream was just me kind of bitching a little bit about life. That was not intentional. It's just I didn't want to get too deep into the chapter story and stop suddenly. So I kind of tried to find a good place to stop, and then I just kind of ranted a little bit. I am sorry about that. But if you're wondering, things have gone from a 2 to a solid 6 over here, and the 1 to 10, how bad is it? Well, how good is it scale, I should say. So we've gone from 2 to 6. I'm better this week than I was last week. We're going to leave it at that. So I'm going to take a little drink here. Tonight I'm drinking, I got some Snake Oil again tonight, but I also got Three Floyd's Turbo Reaper IPA. It is very good. Came in that variety pack that they have at the grocery stores. I'm an IPA gal. Apparently, being a girl into IPAs is super rare, so whatever. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Came out of nowhere. All right, so we have just gotten our introductions to the Ghost of Christmas Past, the biblically accurate Christmas ghost. So now we are moving forward. All right. So the spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand, and as it spoke, and clasped him gently by the arm. "Rise, and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes. That bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, and he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding the spirit made him towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. Okay, am I the only one who, for the very longest time, thought that the Ghost of Christmas Past was meant to be a girl? And my first experience with this story was the Ghost of Christmas Past was a girl. I don't know. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with snow upon the ground. "Good heavens!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the ghost. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge in fever. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and every post and tree, until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap as they went past? Why was he filled with such gladness when he heard them give each other a Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good has it ever done to him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weatherstock surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used, their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clutched and strutted in the stables, and the coach house and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entry the dreary hall, and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. I can't even imagine living in a world without heating. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight, and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them, and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and a scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm, and pointed to his younger self, intent upon reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, and wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading an ass laden with wood by the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba! Yes, I know! One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come, for the first time, just like that. Poor boy! And Valentine," said Scrooge, "and his wild brother, Orson, there they go. And what's his name, who was put down in his drawers, asleep at the gate of the Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he was upon his head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" To hear Scrooge expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in the most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face, would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growing out of the top of its head. There he is! Poor Robin Crusoe! He called him, when he came home again after sailing around the island. Poor Robin Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday running for his life to the little creek. Hola! Hoop! Halloo!" Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuffs, "but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have given him something, that's all." The Scrooge smiled thoughtfully and waved its hands, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk and the windows cracked. Fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were showing instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, and when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays, he was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, putting her arms out about his neck and softly kissed him, addressing him as her dear, dear brother. "I've come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clasping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimming of glee. "Home for good and all, home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed. that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, said the child, opening her eyes, and are never to come back here. But first we're to be together all the Christmas long. Have you the merriest time in all the world? You're quite a woman, little Fan, exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him, in her childish eagerness, towards the door, and he, not loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking his hands with him. Man, imagine having this as your school. They say school's bad now. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shriveling best parlor that ever was seen, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine, and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered implements of those dainties to the young people, at the same time sending out a marriage servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied on to the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster good-bye, right willingly, and getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from the dark leaves and the evergreens like spray. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost. But she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay its spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and answered briefly, Yes. Although he had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, and here too it was Christmas time again. But it was evening, and the streets were lightened up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it? Said Scrooge. Was I apprentice here? They went in, at the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes! There he is! Was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clasp of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters 1, 2, 3, had them up their places 4, 5, 6, barred them and pined them 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have gotten to 12, panting like racehorses. Hilly-ho! Cried Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads. Let's have a lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheery up, Ebenezer! Clear away. There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept and watered, lamps were trimmed, and fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright and bright a ballroom as you could desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomachaches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came 3 Mrs. Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid, with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook, with her brother's particular friend, and the milkman. Particular friend. Victorians had such a funny way of saying lover. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having brought board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couples always turning up in the wrong place, new top couples starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When his result was brought about, old Fezziwig clapped his hands and stopped the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning the rest upon his appearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the old fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There are more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. The great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told him, struck up Sir Rogers de Converley. When old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance, and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time that they would become of them next. And then old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through the dance, advance and retire, hold their hands with your partner, bow and curtsy. Corkscrew, thread the needle and back again at your pace. Fezziwig's cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually, as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. I had never actually had like a company. Well, we did kind of had a company Christmas party, but it was more like a dinner. We never had like a party. And I'm kind of sad I never experienced a corporate party. But then again, I've mostly been working either retail or warehouse gigs, so, well, this was a warehouse gig for them, I guess, so. Beer break. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembering everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He had spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by this remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? What the happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all." "Oh, yeah, that guy who works in my shop. Man, he is so poor. Man, he needs a raise. I need to talk to his boss and oh." His former self turned down the lamp as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy restlessness motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" he rejoined. "A golden one." This is the even-handed dealing of the world," he said. "There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth." "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sworn reproach. I have seen your noble aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, then what then? I am not changed towards you." She shook her head. "Am I?" "Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Your own feeling tells you that you were not what you were," she returned. "I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it, and can release you." "Have I ever sought release?" "In words? No, never." "In what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us," said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, "tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now?" "Ah, no." He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, "You think not?" "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. "Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You who, in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so. Do I not know that your repentance and regret could surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart, and for the love of him you once were." Modern readers would call her stupid for turning down a rich man. Yep. That's why I could never really marry a guy who's too into money. I mean, yeah, there's, making sure you're taken care of, but then there's, like, the love of money. I don't know if I could be with a guy who loved money more than me. He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. You may. The memory of what is past half makes me hope you will have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream. from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She left him, and they parted. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight in to torture me?" "One shadow more," exclaimed the ghost. "No more," cried Scrooge. "No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more." But the relentless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. Sorry. They were in another scene and place, a room not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The noise in this room was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count, and, unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter soon beginning to mingle in the sport, got pillaged by the young brigands more ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude, no. I wouldn't for the wealth of it all. The world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. And for the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off, God bless my soul, to save my life. As to measuring her waist in sport, as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never come straight again, and yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves upon hair, an inch on which could have been a keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and had yet been man enough to know its value. Getting a little personal there, aren't we, Dickens? Well, he did kind of have a crummy childhood, so I guess I can't blame him too much. But now a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that she, with laughing face and plundered dress, was borne towards it, the center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling and the onslaught that was made on the Defiance porter, the scaling him with chairs for ladders to dive into his pockets to spoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hug him round the neck, pummel his pack, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into his mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immediate relief of finding this a false alarm. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children and their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time, up to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever. And the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and being a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I? Tut, don't I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge?" "Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and as it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside, I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone, quite alone in the world, I do believe." Oh no. Oh no. Oh crap. No, don't be stuck. No. No. Okay, there we go. What the hell is that? What the hell is that? It looks like some sort of gum or something. Yeah. By the way, how old was Scrooge supposed to be? Like, I thought he was like in his like 60s, judging by the picture, but let's see, he was probably in his mid-20s by the time his girlfriend broke up with him. And young daughter in her 20s, so she would be in her mid-50s, I want to say. Oy, greed really did do Scrooge a number. Oy, I guess that's the lesson. Don't be greedy, or else you will age rapidly and turn into a curmudgeon old man before you know it. I mean, that's one way to get the message across, I guess. Well, I am glad we started early, because we are just about to get done with this chapter. "Spirit!" cried Scrooge in a broken voice. "Remove me from this place!" "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it!" He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no more!" In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle, in which the ghost, with no visible resistance of its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap and, by a sudden action, pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, but that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed down with all his force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it, in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious from being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. All right, and we're on to stave 3 now. I had a long think about it. I know I joked in the last stream that the ghost of Christmas Past was the biblically accurate Christmas ghost. But now that I think about it, the way that Dickens described it, the way like its arms fluctuated and something like that. I think what he was trying to go for is when you looked on the ghost, it was like looking through a crystal or like a gem. And you know how sometimes when you look through a crystal and things look kind of wonky, where you like see part of a person and da-da-da, and when you move the crystal, they like have fluctuating eyes and arms and blah, blah, blah. I think that was what Dickens was going for. Though that's something like that could not be accomplished in like movie form. I think even now with the CGI we have, that would be a difficult thing to make. Like, I know the Christmas Carol with Jim Carrey in it, when they did the Ghost of Christmas Past, they just did a simple ghost with a flame for a head, and they left it at that. They didn't do the whole like fluctuating arms thing. The one thing they did interesting in that movie that I thought was brilliant was they had all of the ghosts voiced by, well, all the ghosts, I don't know, I can't remember if the Ghost of Future spoke at all, but the ghosts were voiced by Jim Carrey too, which that was interesting. That's actually kind of brilliant in a way. All right, I'm gonna top off the last of this one beer and open the next. I was at the comic shop earlier today, and I have been trying to hound my family members for Christmas presents. For some diddly dang reason, they get all up in my business demanding a Christmas list, and then when I ask them, hey, what do you want for Christmas? You know, because I want to get them something to open on Christmas. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, you don't need to, or oh, you don't have to, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's like, look, I know I'm poor, but can you give me something to gift to you? Anyways, apparently, my stepdad always wants something weird, and so I was at the comic shop earlier with my boyfriend. He picked out a few Conan comics for himself, but I did find a wacky little action figure. I'm not going to say it here just in case he tunes into this YouTube channel. But yeah, I think it's wacky enough for him, and I can definitely see him putting it up into his home office because he always has like the weirdest crap in his office. It's very funny, but don't worry, I don't plan on ever getting drunk on stream. Because when I get drunk, I do not have a filter. Like, if you think that I can be very politically incorrect on these streams, oh my goodness, when I am drunk, I get very politically incorrect. All right. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's invitation. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp outlook all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being unusually equal to the time o' day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter. Between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center a blaze of ruddy light. Hold on. And center of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon when the clock proclaimed the hour, which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at that very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. Oh, very, very strange side note, by the way. This is a very strange side note. I have no idea why, but in the last few years, I've noticed that boys, like teenage boys, will dress up as Ebenezer Scrooge for Halloween. I've seen it 2 Halloweens in a row, and it's like, why are these young boys dressing up as Scrooge for Halloween? And the second Halloween, that was my own little brother. He dressed up as Scrooge. People asked him if he was the boy in the striped pajamas, but it's like, why are these young men, like, dressing up as Scrooge? I don't get it. Please, if you are a young boy, let me know what is going on and why. I don't know. Doop-a-doo. I wish I could give the summary of Martin's other comics here, but I don't speak Spanish. So if you speak Spanish and you know what the plot of these comics are, please leave a comment below, because I would love to give Martin some more work and get more people to read his stuff. It's just I don't speak or read Spanish. I only know hola, ¿cómo estás? Lo siento, ¿dónde está el baño? That's all I know in Spanish. All right. Back to the book. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with lively green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped up upon the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in the shape not unlike Punty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in, and know me better, man!" Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though his eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe or mantle bordered with white fur. Its garments hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample foils of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set there and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger member of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my eldest brothers born these later years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid I have not." "Have you many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas Present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausage, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of the night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe,
the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, and scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the top of their homes. Once it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down in the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. It's in the coming of the street corner choir. It's getting hot and getting warm by the fire. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the lyrics right now. Forgive me. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed up in the deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to entrance, and in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one constant, caught fire, and were blazing away in their dear heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and the brightest summer sun might have endeavored in diffuse in vain. By the way, let me know how I am doing, folks. I know I'm a little awkward with my reading, but please let me know how I'm doing. I'm trying to get used to reading on stream. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a worldly jest, laughing heartily as if it went right, and not less heartily as if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiters were radiant in their glory. There were great round pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the streets in their apocalyptic opulence. Has anybody actually toasted chestnuts on the fire? I have never done that before. I keep seeing chestnuts at the grocery store, and I have never toasted them. Then again, I've never had a actual fireplace to toast chestnuts in, so there we go. There were ruddy brown-faced, broad-githered Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glancing demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in the blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance an ancient walk among the woods, and pleasant shufflings angled deep through withered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among these choice fruits in a bowl. Though members of a dull and stagnant blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers! Oh, the grocers! Nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descended on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and ruler parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, and candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and plumpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts of which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas dolls to peck as if they chose. Beer break. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel. I have always gone to church on Christmas Eve. I can't imagine going to church on Christmas. And away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes, and with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as if their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled with each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadow forth of all these dinners and the progress of their cooking, in the thawing blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. "Is there a particular flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it most." "Spirit," said Scrooge, after a moment's thought, "I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to crab these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. I? Cried the spirit. You would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? I? Cried the spirit. You would seek to close these places on the 7th day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek? Exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, but who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Yeah, stop giving me crap for the shit other people do. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as graceful and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off his power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling, with a sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. Sorry, Dickens put quotation marks around bob, like bob as in the currency. So I find it funny that he acknowledged the pun there. Week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6 pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoicing to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. Those young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his colours nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbled up, knocking loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha Mother, said the two. Here's Martha Mother, said the two young Cratchits. Hurrah! There's such a goose, Mother, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear. How late you are, said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking her shawl and bonnet from her with officious zeal. We'd a deal of work to finish up last night, replied the girl, and had to clear away this morning, Mother. See, guys, women did work before the 50s. It's just they were poor women. All right, anyway. What? Well, never mind, so long as you are come, said Mrs. Cratchit. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye. No, no, there's father coming, cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide! So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with... and in came little Bob, all right, father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive to the fridge hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door, and ran into his arms while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did Tiny Tim behave? Asked Miss Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob in his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. Beer break. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much. Sorry, oh my goodness. There we go. A little bit of bubbles were coming up. Sorry about that, folks. And better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hopes the people saw him in church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tumultuous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hardy. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and came back Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth it was something very like in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates, and Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons in their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit looked slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and a feeble cry, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the apple sauce and mashed potatoes was a sufficient dinner for the whole family, and indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular, were steeped in the sage and onion to the eyebrow. By now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it, while they were merry with the goose, and a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. The smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flustered, but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quadrant of ignited brandy, and bedding with Christmas holly stuck up into the top. Oh, a wondrous pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she could confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Oh man, I have been there, dear. Every experimental recipe I have tried, I always get nervous of, crap, did I add too much of this or too little of this? Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flatly hearsay to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound of the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "Oh, no," said the Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome by patience and grief. "Yeah, it don't sound so great when someone else says it out loud, does it?" I do. That's part of the reason why I love A Christmas Carol, because Dickens was not afraid to make Scrooge an absolute bastard in the beginning, and you can tell that he thought it out. Like, a lot of the wealthier businessmen who are like stuck up in their money houses and they're so disjointed from the rest of the world around them, when they say stupid crap like that, they don't entirely understand what they're saying. I think that's a very interesting thing that Dickens does. He points out that a lot of these rich men, when they say half the crap they do, they don't really understand what their words mean. It's a very interesting observation. Like, I've heard so many stories about congressmen or just politicians in general who they pass these laws for like small businesses, make sure things run right, but it's as soon as they get out of office and as soon as they start their own businesses and they have to play by the rules that they themselves set, they're like, oh crap, this actually was a really bad idea. I even remember George Bush. I sometimes I look back on his presidency and I wonder, did he actually want to be president? Because a lot of his actions after his presidency leads me to believe that he never actually wanted to be president, which is disturbing in its own way. We are past the halfway point, which is what I wanted to accomplish tonight. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what man shall live, what man shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on it the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and, trembling, cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily upon hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob,
I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," said Bob, was Bob's mild answer. "Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness to it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled of full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge and Scrooge the Bearful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a miller's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also, how she had seen a countess at a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter. At which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely indeed, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eyes upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By the time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires of kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There, all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here, again, were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls,
all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripping lightly off some near neighbor's house, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it in a glow. I need to blow my nose real quick. Please forgive me. I am over my sick, but it is still cold in winter and my nose still runs. So it goes. Man, I would like to read something from Kurt Vonnegut on this channel. That'd be interesting. I read Slaughterhouse-Five back in high school, and I was a dumb teenager, so I couldn't really appreciate the book for what it was. Though I heard Vonnegut's other stuff is also quite interesting. But Slaughterhouse-Five was... Oh my... I know I'm getting off track. I'm going to get back to reading in a second, but I just got to tell this story real quick. So, along with reading Slaughterhouse-Five in class, we also watched a bit of the Slaughterhouse-Five movie. And the scene where the dude is in the hospital and they call his wife to let her know that he was in an accident and was in the hospital. The scene then cuts to her sobbing like crazy and just driving like a madman, getting into all kinds of accidents. And it was the funniest thing we have seen in class all year. That was the funniest thing. I mean, it's sad, but it was also very, very funny. All right, anyway. Anyway. But if you had judged from the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fire half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exuded. How it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran out on before, dotting the dusky street with speckles of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughing out loud as the spirit passed, though little keened the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and deserted moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of giants. And water spread itself wherever it listed, or would have done so, but on the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the settling sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of dark night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, whose labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See!" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely they stopped, his vigor sank again. Sorry. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his rope, and passing on above the moor, sped whither? Not the sea? To the sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, at frightful range of the rock behind him, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns as it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, a seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed. But here, 2 men who watched the light had made a fire, and through the loophole in... Okay, come on. There we go. All right, and through the loophole in the thick of stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat. They wished each other a Merry Christmas in their can of grog. And one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until, being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. He stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it, and every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any other day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. I can't imagine spending Christmas away from all your loved ones on a boat like that. Cheers to all you men working on oil rigs or on fishing boats and whatnot who can't be home for Christmas. Cheers. Debating whether to have popcorn or a grilled cheese sandwich after this. Either way, yeah. Gonna open up the last of the cans here. It's been reading for a while. I need to keep my whistle wet. It was snowing a few days ago over here, but it got warm suddenly, so we had rain. It was the perfect day to have some pho, the Vietnamese noodle dish. That's where my boyfriend went. We went to have some pho and some spring rolls, too, and some Vietnamese coffee, which I wish I could have had another cup of that. The Vietnamese coffee is pretty stonkin' delicious.
Alright. Got more reading yet. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secret as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance." I love how Dickens is like constantly breaking the fourth wall here to add in his own little commentary. I heard he actually wrote this within a month, and I can kind of see it. But at the same time, he is a master writer, so even if it was written within a month, it's still well written. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face in the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily, "Ha ha 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 ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame to him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised look, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head, although she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasantly as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do anything good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha ha, that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sister and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill winds? Himself indeed. Here he takes into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He won't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table, there clustered round the fire by lamplight.
Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. How many more pages do I got in this chapter? All right. We'll get to the end of the dinner party, then I think that should be a good place to stop. Scrooge's nephew reveled in another laugh, as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequences of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they all laughed at so, and they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle. You know what? I think I might stop there. Just because it is only 5 minutes until it's the 2-hour mark. Yeah. Oh, we got a good distance there. Got a good distance. Yeah, yes. Yeah, I got the edition where it's the little red book that you can pick up, which apparently is like supposed to be similar to how the book was bound way back in the day. Oh boy, my throat. I've said it before, but part of the reason why I read on stream like this is I'm trying to get used to talking more. Because I actually don't talk that much on a daily basis. Unless I'm with someone I like my family or my friends or my boyfriend, obviously. I actually don't talk that much throughout the day, so these streams are in a way to help me talk more because, well, I want to be a creator. I want to be an entertainer of sorts, not like a Mr. Beast kind of entertainer, but someone who entertains people. So entertainer, whatever. But that requires a lot of talking and a lot of reading and a lot of, expressing myself. And I'm trying to get used to that. I'm almost 30 and I have to train myself to be expressive.
Yeah, I know. I'm quite pathetic in that sense. But yeah, when you're I'm a writer. So I'm used to just writing the words. I'm not used to actually reading the words or actually speaking much. And especially with how I am, I need to be more mindful with how I speak, and I need to learn how to like express myself and affectate. And that's what part of the reason why I do these reading streams. And sometimes I say stupid shit, but whatever. I do hope that you guys are entertained by Slowdown Sundays and by my regular stream. I'm thinking about doing another stream on Friday, a fun fancy Friday, where I just basically kind of do whatever the hell I do on Mondays, but more? I don't know. Anyways, so after A Christmas Carol, I do have a couple of Conan short story books, the original, like, Robert E. Howard stories. I'm thinking of contacting whoever holds the license to Conan and being like, hey, I want to read the original stories on stream. Can I do so? And I'm sure it's going to be, like, fine. But still. The last thing I want is to have everything shut down because... You know? Alright, so let's turn this off. Oh, by the way, funds all raised. I'm going to shut down the Indiegogo once I place the order. And I'm going to make an announcement that if you want to purchase a physical copy after the campaign has ended, just email me and I will get it to you. But now that is done, thank you all for joining me, and I will see you next week or tomorrow, depending on which stream you like to watch. Bye.